Hi, I'm John Kennedy. I'm going to be your host on our film where we explore a biological approach to climate change. This is a new paradigm of restoring the cycles of water, soil, and vegetation. Rather than draining rainwater directly into the streams and hence into the ocean, we want to retain it in all the landscaped ecosystems, that is, agricultural lands, forests, and cities. We're going to show you examples of that. Moisture can penetrate the soil, replenish the groundwater, and rise into the atmosphere so that it can regulate temperature locally and create more rainfall. So these are interrelated concepts of capturing rain in healthy soil, and through that having more plant growth which can sequester carbon into the soil. And this constitutes a new way of looking at addressing climate change. We're going to show you some examples of this. We visit with a rancher who shows us how managed grazing of cattle can improve the soil and the health of rangelands so that the carbon can be drawn down through the deep roots of perennial grasses and plants. We visit with a Piscinus ranch to help us understand the concepts of regenerative agriculture and how farming with animals and plants working together can sequester carbon. We have a memorable visit with an expert on forests, exhorting us to save the big old trees, as these are the ones that sequester the most carbon. We'll visit a luxurious vegetable front yard garden, almost entirely irrigated with rainwater. Another front yard has cobbled riverbed through the bushes that contains a sump capturing all the runoff from the roof and the yard. Okay, so it's important to remember that this is just part of the story. There are many ways like this that people around the world are doing things that are contributing to this cycle that's self-generative. We're looking at ways of cooling the planet and restoring water. And we're going to take a look at those now. So let's go. We're here on a ranch with Joe Morris, just in the hills, just up from Watsonville. Just starting up into the foothills. It's beautiful here, and I want to ask Joe some questions about grazing and land management, and what are you going to tell us about the land here?
These hills behind us were huge sand dunes at one point, and now they've evolved over time to be redwood canyons and grassy grasslands. Filled with a whole array of plants and animals. But, you know, in the last 150 to 200 years, they've been used as grazing lands for domestic livestock. I've been here since 1996, and we manage about 3,000 acres here. And T.O. Cattle Company is my business, and our mission is to nurture peaceful relationships between people, land, and animals. And so all of our management decisions are guided by that mission.
Here's Joe's dogs running around up and down the creek here. We're right by a little natural creek that comes out of the hills here. And it's kind of hot here, and they're enjoying getting wet.
Yeah.
You can see there's a lot of plant life here too.
Right. And that plant life doesn't just happen by accident. It happens as a function of our management. There are lots of ranches where you could go to what is a creek and not find this kind of vegetation. Mm-hmm. When you manage for the health of the animals and the plants and our pocketbook, you get more life for everything. The capacity of the land increases to support life. And then you go to creeks on our ranches, virtually every ranch that we manage, every creek, they all have vegetation growing in them, water flowing in them for longer and longer periods of time during the year, and lots of life, which is why I wanted to come here, because this is sort of a microcosm of what we'd like to see around the earth, right? More capacity for life, which depends on more water, which depends on more plants, which depends on our management.
So where's the water coming from here where we're looking at? Because we're up in the hills, it's pretty dry. If we were looking, as we drove in here, it's all golden California hills. It's pretty dry, it's hot.
Yeah.
But there's water coming here somewhere.
There is. One of the ways that water gets into those springs and these creeks is through, either surface flows, which is called runoff, or, which I'd like to see, subsurface flows, which isn't runoff. The water doesn't flow across the soil, it moves down into the soil profile and thence through the soil.
Yeah, and it probably increases the water table when it does that, right? It's going in and it's being retained, and so the water table is rising slightly.
It is, it is, and I don't know that we know the limits of how much it can change. But I do know that every incremental change implies incrementally greater capacity to support life, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. So all of our management is intended to slow the flow of water and as high on the watershed as possible. Most people think in terms of water flowing in creeks, and you put dams in, or you put a reservoir. Well, the soil itself is the greatest reservoir, potentially. But in order to be a reservoir, it has to have space for air and water among the little particles of soil. And those particles of soil are aggregated by living microorganisms. And those living microorganisms depend on carbon moving from the atmosphere through plants to where they can eat it. And then they do their thing, and it increases the carbon in the soil, which increases the aggregation of, increases the size of the aggregates, the soil particles. And when you have little tiny soil particles, there's no space for air or water. But when you have big particles like this, there's all kinds of space around each and every one of them.
And so how you manage the land around that and how the cattle come across the land has a big effect on whether you have that larger particles and the ability for the soil to absorb more moisture.
It has a big effect. And I think, it's key to the long time, the reversal of desertification. Well, that's what we're managing. We're managing 3,000 acres in this ranch on which photosynthesis can occur, and we'd like it to occur as much as possible, because photosynthesis moves carbon from the atmosphere into the soils, into our animals and the wildlife and the plants and this beauty, and our cells and even our ideas are manifestations of photosynthesis. So, and that carbon cycle. So that's what we do. We manage it, and we manage it by allowing our animals to eat and satisfy their hunger and their needs. But we also manage those animals so that they move away after they've eaten, so that the plants that they've grazed can recover. And that process of recovery is when all that photosynthesis happens.
So how often do you, on a place like this, you don't really have clear paddocks or anything, so how do you move the cattle around?
Well, one of the reasons we don't have clear paddocks is because you can't see them, but they are there. And we want them to look, if you have fences all over the place, it looks, no pun intended, offensive, But there's a fence right behind us. And you can see a fence post. There's three fence posts right over there. And there's one over there, and there's one wire that goes across there. And we train our animals so that they see that one wire and they say, oh, go back, you are going the wrong way, And so they stay where we put them. And we have a plan that governs their movement. And it's based on the recovery needs of the grasses and willows that they eat. For example, the cattle have been in here this year. In fact, they were in here, I think, 3 or 4 times. The latest time they were in here was probably early June. And you can see in the time, now it's August 2nd, so in 60 days, say, the animals weren't here.
Yeah, and there's new growth. We're standing around it a little, and yeah, it's amazing.
There's lots and lots and lots of growth. I mean, if you were a cow, this is where you'd be if you weren't governed by someone who had a bigger plan and some dogs. I've got the plan, and the dogs help me execute the plan. They have fun, the cattle don't mind, and and we manage for that triple bottom line.
So when the cattle were here in June, how long were they in this area?
They were in here. We figure on our plan that this is about a 25-acre field. We had 700 animals, and we figured that this 25 acres could provide food for a day and a half.
Wow.
So they were here for between a day and a half, and then they moved. And they ate a lot of the plants that were here, but now the plants have had time to recover, and recover they have. And and now we're preparing effectively to receive water next year, when and if it comes. And if it doesn't come, we want to hold the water that's here as long as possible. And that's that's how our thinking works.
Good.
So the manure is waste to the cow, but contains food, nutrients for other creatures, and the dung beetle is among them. And the dung beetles, they take some of those nutrients, and they move them down into the soil, moving it into areas that other creatures, other microbes can take advantage of them. And they also, some of them eat the fly larvae, so there's not a huge population an overwhelming population of flies that bother the animals. So there's all these kinds of functions, and they're moving this organic material down into the soil, all of which is a plus for the soil community. And so we love to see them.
This is Sally Calhoun from Piscinas Ranch, and we were already talking about how she got into this thing. 7,600 acres, and just seeing what you can do now that you're here.
Yeah, a few months after we got here, I met a woman who used to own this ranch, and in fact she and her husband could not figure out how to keep it and ended up selling it to the very developers that we bought it from. And she told me there was a book I should read called Holistic Management by Alan Savory, because she'd been practicing holistic management. And she said to me, if I'd read this book, I'd still own this ranch, not you. And so I said, okay. And I went home and I read the book and was totally intrigued by the fact that we might be able to change the way we manage livestock on these huge landscapes. And we might be able to bring back, for me, the California native perennial grasses were the compelling thing. Because I'd been growing those in my yard for 15 years. And I knew they were gone from here. And the idea that they could come back, it's just like this little worm that burrowed into my head and has never left. So that's actually why I became a rancher, was to try and get the perennial grasses to come back. And of course, since then, one thing has led to another, and now we're into pastured meats. We're in the process of taking back our certified organic row crop ground that Earthbound is farming, and we're going to get into farming, and we've planted this vineyard. So it's not just about managing cattle to bring back California native perennial grasses anymore. It's gotten much bigger than that, and it's about sequestering carbon and changing the way agriculture works in all of North America to improve soil health.
So can we talk about soil health for a minute? I heard a little bit about how you prepared this before you actually put the vineyard in. Could you talk a little bit about how you're creating soil health here?
Sure. So we came out here onto the rangeland. We wanted to put in a vineyard, and we found a good site, and we were very careful to site it in a place where there had previously been vineyard, because we didn't want to plow up a section of pasture land, of rangeland that had never been disturbed with farming. So we found this spot, and we knew that once we planted the vines, our intent was never to till again. So we actually wanted to improve the soil health fairly dramatically before we did the planting. So we came through and put in a dusting of compost, just a very, very thin layer of standard commercial compost, and then planted cover crops for a couple of years, things like vetch and clover and some grain crops. And then we used managed grazing and high density grazing with sheep and cattle through those 2 seasons to improve the soil up here. So what we wanted to do was have soil that was alive and could hold water before we started the vineyard, and so it was a 3-year process to make that happen. So the idea is, it turns out that what you really want to do to improve soil health is you want to grow a diverse set of plants. You want all these different kinds of roots in the soil at the same time working together, and it turns out it's really synergistic to do that. So both years we had a diverse cover crop mix. So for 2 cool seasons, we didn't irrigate it or anything. We just came out before it started to rain and planted cool season annuals and a diverse mix of them.
So you prepared the soil for 3 years, the various things grew, the soil became healthier.
Right, we increased the soil organic matter fairly dramatically, which is a real indicator of life in the soil.
And then you planted, and how do you plan to work the vineyard as it matures?
So a couple of things about the design before we get to the working. So if you notice this vineyard, something looks a little odd to you if you've seen normal vineyards. Normally this wire, which is where the vines would be trained, is about here.
Right.
Right. So this vineyard is designed so that the vines grow and they fruit much higher, so that sheep can be in the vineyard all year round. So we like to say that the sheep are actually going to manage the vineyard. So it will be set up so that it will grow, hopefully have plants growing all year round, and the sheep will periodically come through the vineyard and graze what's growing in the vineyard. And also they will help us to manage the vines themselves, because they will graze away all the little suckers which grow up the vines.
So you're going to let them eat on the vines?
They'll eat the little green leaves. We won't leave them long enough that they start to eat the trunk. But yes, they'll do that. And the other thing they'll do is that when the vines come over, if they droop over this way and get low, they'll eat the ends off. So both of those things are actually done by hand in California vineyards today. So that saves a lot of labor. And we believe, based on some trials, that our ranch manager, Kelly Mulville, who's really the brains behind this whole thing, he invented this kind of vineyard. He did some trials that indicated that he saved about 90% of the irrigation water over a conventional vineyard.
Why is that?
Because the ground is covered all of the time. It turns out that when you have bare soil, the ground gets much, much hotter and the water just evaporates. The other reason is because we've increased the soil organic matter, and because the soil will be covered in the winter, we expect to capture a lot more of the rainfall that does fall, right? It doesn't really matter how much rain falls. All that matters is how much rain that you capture, the effective rainfall.
Right.
So we would expect to have much more effective rainfall and to be able to hold on to that water. So it's a combination of losing less during the growing season and also capturing more. And he also saw increased yields, probably because the plants appreciate the improved soil health. And there's a lot of evidence that the grazing by the animals actually helps stimulate plant growth.
Interesting. Okay, so we were just asking about the difference between how you're doing this and how it's traditionally done in a vineyard.
Right, so we talked about the fact that the vines would be lower, but that's not really the key point. It's really about how we're managing the surface of the soil and the soil itself. In a traditional vineyard, usually there would be no animals at all, ever. There are some vineyards that are grazed here in California during the winter, during the cool season. So some of them, while the vines are dormant, the animals will come in and eat the annual grasses, or even a cover crop or something that gets planted in the middle. But generally in California, if there were ever animals, they're all taken out before the buds break, because otherwise they'll be damaged by the animals. So we are setting up so that the animals can be in here all year round. The other thing that's normally happens in California is that there's tilling that happens between the rows of grapes. And a lot of times they even go so far as to create a dust mulch. So basically what you'll see as you drive back through the vineyards is that the ground is totally bare. You see these green vines and you see this bare ground. And what we know now is that's devastating for the soil biology that's attempting to live there. Both to have nothing growing and to have the ground be uncovered is just catastrophic. I mean, we look at it and go, it's as if you took your skin and cut it. It's literally that painful for what's happening there. So it's really about the bare ground that you see all over California, and the tilling. I think Kelly likes to say that in an average organic vineyard, where they can't use herbicides to kill any of the plants that they view as competition to the grapevines, there can easily be 15 tractor passes a year up and down each of these rows. When you think about it, it's kind of like it's a road,
compacting,
and it's getting tilled.
Yeah.
So our expectation here is that obviously we're never going to till, and we will only need to drive up and down the rows if we need to spray for mildew. And we're actually even talking about trying to do that from a drone.
Wow.
So that we won't end up with this center here being like a road, which is what you see in a normal vineyard, a tilled bare road. So we really want to manage the soil surface, and that's what will give us an effective water cycle. Because we will have a live soil biology, and we won't get a lot of runoff of bare ground when the rains come.
Wonderful.
This part was already regrowing when we.
And you plan to just let it keep growing as it is then?
We do. I mean, we graze it. We use managed grazing on it. So our whole riparian corridor is grazed very thoughtfully, mostly with cattle. And we think that's really important for the health of the riparian corridor. I mean, what we'd really love to have is beavers. We would love for them to come and make some dams and slow the river down and also clear some of the trees. We like some of the smaller willows to be taken out. We believe that would actually be good, but other than grazing with cattle, we don't really have an economically reasonable way to do that. So we graze in a way that the best we can, and we hope for the return of beavers one day, either by us, which looks like a really long shot at the moment in California, or maybe they'll just appear. So the contrast here is what we just drove through, right now, bare ground, right? Nothing growing.
Right.
Here, we have probably 12 to 15 different kinds of plants that are growing, and what we're trying to do is transition from a system like that one, where there's all kinds of tillage and a monoculture, to a system where there are green plants growing all year round and a wide variety of those plants growing. The ground is always covered. We used managed grazing to stimulate the plants and improve the soil health. So it's really just a different system. And over time, we expect to add more perennial crops like perennial grasses, potentially trees, to this system here. And we're doing a lot of work with an organization called Point Blue. So we're doing really extensive monitoring of the soil biology here and in the fields that are still being farmed in the conventional organic way, and in another field where we've only been farming for 6 months. So we really want to document this transition period and figure out how quickly can we transition from that to something that really does have healthy soil and is growing much more nutrient-dense food.
What's it like for you to be doing this as opposed to being in the Silicon Valley world?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I haven't missed high tech for a nanosecond since I got here. I mean, tech was fun and interesting and challenging in its own way, but it is like as simple as falling off a log compared to what we're trying to do here. I mean, if you think of natural systems and how complex all this stuff is and how little we understand it, this is just endlessly fascinating. And plus, it has all these other ramifications in terms of human health and climate change. It's just so much more interesting. You could never make me go back.
Okay, so today we find ourselves in the Henry Cowell Redwood State Park with Dr. Betsy Herbert, who has a PhD in environmental studies. And she spent a lot of her career on trees and watershed, and we're going to go into that here. But we're in this wonderful place with the big redwoods here in the middle of Santa Cruz County. And we want to talk some about forests and how they contribute to the carbon cycle and the water cycle. So hi, Betsy.
Hi, so nice to be here in this beautiful forest on this beautiful day.
So what do you think about trees and their place with carbon?
Well, since we're sitting right here in the middle of old growth redwood trees, we just happen to be in the midst of the species that sequesters carbon faster than any other species in the world.
Wow.
So these huge trees here, they don't just stop growing. They keep putting on girth, just kind of like, middle age. They just keep packing on the girth, and that means they're sequestering more and more carbon as they continue to age, sometimes up to thousands of years. Mm-hmm. So they are priceless in terms of natural storehouses of carbon.
So the carbon is being stored in the wood of the tree and in the roots?
It's the entire tree, the leaves, the branches, the trunks, and the root systems. Everything in the tree. It's the basis of the whole photosynthesis cycle to convert carbon dioxide and water into biomass, and with the offshoot of oxygen. releasing oxygen. So during that whole process, not only do we get the benefit of the oxygen being released, we also have the benefit of the carbon being stored. And it's throughout the entire tree system. There's been some recent scientific work done to quantify how much carbon is stored in the part of the tree that's above ground where it's easier to measure. Stephen Sillett has done some wonderful research, he and his team, where they've actually measured every branch, every twig, every leaf of some of the largest old trees, redwood trees. And they're the ones who found out that these trees don't stop growing once they get to be giant. They just keep right on packing on that carbon.
How do big trees differ from little trees in how they grab carbon?
I like to think about it as if you had two bank accounts. One of them was, let's say, you had $100 in the bank and you were earning 10% interest. In the other one, you had $1 million in the bank, but you were only getting 1%. Which bank account would you rather have?
Right.
And that's kind of, it's not really even an exaggeration. So the little trees may pull the carbon out quickly relative to their size, but they're so tiny that it doesn't really make any difference.
And they don't last as long also, right? I mean, these big trees are really long-lived, and so they're holding that carbon.
They're holding, not only holding enormous amounts of carbon, but they continue to grab onto the carbon. And because of their great size, if they put on one tree ring for every year, those tree rings are just pulling in that carbon. So they're storehouses.
So in addition to holding carbon, you also said that trees have a major part to play in a hydrologic cycle.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
yes, that's how I really started to get interested in forests, was because I saw some of the damage that was done just locally from logging operations that were occurring up in the mountains where I lived for 20 years. I would see, because our soils here are very erosive soils that we have, steep slopes and sandy soils, and so they're fragile. And when you have heavy equipment and when you're cutting trees on these steep slopes, you get a lot of sediment coming down. And when the rain falls, it all washes into the streams. And then if you also cut trees along the streams, you're opening up the streams to more and more sediment. So that's how I first got interested in forests, because I know how important they are for protecting not only the quality of the water, the roots hold the soil, and the soil is incredibly important as a natural filtration system for water. So when the rain falls, or when the fog drip comes down from these giant redwoods, the soils are able to, because the forest soils are loamy, and they're able to act like a sponge and soak up the water. So that's an advantage of having undisturbed soils. The trees themselves also hold a lot of water, and they transpire water into the atmosphere. And so if you've ever noticed on a hot day, you're in the forest, it'll be many degrees cooler in the forest. That's not just because of the shade, although that's a big part of it. It's also because of the evaporative effect of the water being evaporated. It cools everything down. So that has also a big effect on the atmosphere. And some recent science has shown that the forest, although it might take water from local streams, because they're so big and because the water travels all the way up the trunks into the leaves, it might soak up more water from the streams in the small picture. In the larger picture, that water is going up into the atmosphere and is released as rain. So it has a very important role in the whole hydrologic cycle.
So in this cycle, we're talking about where there is a lot of greenery, we have sort of a wetter evaporation than if you were in a cement downtown.
Oh, absolutely.
Where you have
Yeah.
evaporation, but it's just heat.
It's right.
And actually, so the clouds can form better around that wetness and that cooler temperature. Is that right?
That's right. And also, I think I mentioned before the fog drip,
Mm-hmm.
where the fog rolls in, and we all see it here in Santa Cruz, downtown or in the mountains. When the fog comes in, that fog condenses off the canopy of the redwood trees, and it falls. It's almost like on a really foggy day in a heavily forested watershed. It's almost like you're walking in a light shower with the rain coming down. You might need a raincoat.
Mm-hmm.
And that water comes down and it keeps the ferns and all of the other plant life growing beneath the trees. It keeps them green even in the dry season. And of course, you know, we have the dry season, the Mediterranean climate with a very long dry season.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that things stay relatively green. And that's because of a lot of it is, I think, 40% of the water that comes into the redwood forest is from fog drip. So it's a pretty amazing feature that enables them to live in a climate where there's no rainfall in the summer.
Okay, so we're here in Felton visiting Richard, and this is his house, and we want to see what he's done to his yard, because he's transformed it into a place from which he gets the food that he eats. So can you tell us a little bit what you got here?
It's basically an organic garden. It's squash, tomatoes, potatoes, lettuce, and kale, and a variety of other things, and onions.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to walk around and look at everything to remember how much is here.
So Richard, I was going to ask you about the amount of water it takes to grow all this stuff. How do you get your water on? I see there's drip, but and you live in Felton, so you have more water, rain, than we have in Santa Cruz, I guess.
I don't have the water that takes to feed this garden, but I do augment it. I've got a gray water system, so anything that goes down the shower or a kitchen sink or a bathroom sink comes out to the garden.
Mm-hmm.
And I have gardens in front and back, so it goes both places. It's a decent little system. It goes to a pump. When the pump reaches a certain fill rate, the pump goes on, pumps it out. It doesn't take any work from my part, except once in a while I go out and I rinse off the filters that help clean out anything that comes through the sink, so it won't plug up the nozzles of the dripper.
So a lot of this is getting water from the household then,
Yes.
As secondary
It's not a lot of water,
Yeah,
because it's just me using water, so it's not going to be a lot.
yeah.
I've been trying to encourage myself to take longer showers. It's good for the garden, but I just don't take long enough showers to really make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And next year I'm going to have a rain system catch all the rain. I wish I had it this year because it rained an enormous amount.
Yeah.
I didn't have the barrels ready, but I'm going to get some tanks and bury them in the ground, because I don't want all these tanks sitting around above the ground, because I want to enjoy the view of the gardens.
Sure.
So I'm going to put in the system necessary to catch the rain that falls on the roof and any place else I can catch it. And I've got a fair amount of roof, and it did fill up that one barrel over there,
Mm-hmm.
and it would have filled up dozens of them the way it rained here.
Mm-hmm.
All the amendments and the soil itself is organic. I do compost my vegetable waste, which is all the waste I basically have. I don't have any meat waste because I don't eat any. And that's because I like being healthy, and I'm doing pretty well for a 71-year-old man. And I intend to keep going. When I reach the age of 80, I intend to be just as healthy and just as good looking. At some point, I should introduce you to the backyard, because that's when you can get a look at the solar panels. And there's a lot of those that make this place work, because I heat with solar, I drive with solar, everything in the house runs on solar power, And that's a big point of why I bought this house, because I wanted lots of sunshine
Yeah, I can feel it. It's great.
that I could turn into energy. I don't pay any electric bills.
So we're back here in the backyard, and we're looking at some more beds and the bamboo from which you got the stakes for the front garden, and we wanted to take a look at your solar panels, which are up on the roof there. And you've got plenty of sun. It's amazing. How many panels do you have?
I think I have in excess of 24.
It's a good
It's a lot of panels, but
It is.
I don't pay for electricity.
Right.
And I drive an electric car, so I don't pay for fuel for my car. And I've been doing that for 3 or 4 years. At night, I'm still on PG&E, but I sell more electricity
Right.
than I use.
Right.
So I get credit, so I don't pay any bills. And not paying bills is one of my favorite things I love to do.
Yeah. Okay, so we're here at Mary's house, and we're going to look at a project she did here to deal with runoff coming off of the roof. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you guys got into this.
Sure. Started with an email, and it was an email sent out to many people saying, who wants to have their house be a demonstration project for rainwater catchment? Golden Love, a local wonderful permaculture landscape guy, came over. He checked this property out and a number of others and said, this one is going to work for this project. So we got selected. We actually got some people from the homeless garden to come over and paid them, decent livable wage, to come with the picks and the really, well, it was all sweat equity, but really hard work. They dug a 6 foot by 6 foot deep by 6 foot wide infiltration, big hole right where you're standing. We're standing on this massive hole.
So all the water from the roof is coming down through some pipes and leading here, and then it's seeping into the ground.
Yeah. So all of the water from this roof now is channeled and directed, and none of it runs onto the street, which was a major objective, and the city sponsored it because they want people to stop directing their water onto the street and into the rain drains and right down into the bay.
Sure.
Yeah. So it was so much fun when the first rain came. And I saw my neighbors with all this water pouring down their driveways, and it was so bad, and I thought, oh, what's going to happen? And it worked perfectly.
We're here out in Aptos at Polo Grounds Park with Sierra Ryan, who's in the county, works for the county in environmental health as a water resources planner. And Sierra, you're going to tell us a little bit about a project here that's been installed.
Yes, that's right. So we're here at the Polo Grounds Park. It's a county-owned park in Aptos, and we have a demonstration of a water recharge project here. So the great thing about this project is it captures stormwater from the surrounding area, the parking lot, the roads, and some of the watershed. It treats it in a bioswale, and then it recharges it into the ground in a passive way that involves very little maintenance and very little treatment. And this site and another site further down the park together capture about 20 acre-feet of water a year.
Which is a lot of water.
It's a lot of water.
And you said that's most of the water that would fall on this entire area.
That's right, yeah.
Including this whole park.
Most of the park does end up in one of the 2 recharge basins, yes.
Okay, so what's a bioswale?
So a bioswale is a natural system that we've designed to mimic the natural processes where parking lot runoff falls into the bioswale and is naturally filtered and treated through a number of different processes. That way the water is clean before we direct it into the groundwater basin.
And when you direct it, it's running out in some pipes?
There's a number of underground pipes below the bioswale that go to a distribution box here that lead to a dozen wells that are 30 feet deep and 4 feet wide in diameter, and that allows the water to passively enter the wells and then percolate into the aquifer.
And from my, as a private well owner, it's kind of like a septic system of the leach fields of a septic system, that it's draining out through some gravel places back into the earth.
Exactly, and this site was chosen strategically. It's in an area where it's overlying the Purissima Aquifer, which is one of the main water supply aquifers for the Mid-County area. So we're actually recharging the groundwater that people drink, which is a little different than a septic system.
Yeah. Right. Got a map here. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at?
Yeah, so this map was put together by the University of California, Santa Cruz, Dr. Andy Fisher's lab, in partnership with the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County. It's a suitability map that basically helps us to understand where we can do recharge projects. So you see here it says MAR, that's Managed Aquifer Recharge. It's great because it identifies for us areas that are likely to create good recharge projects. So then we can go into those areas and do some further research, look at the watershed, the land use around it, the need for recharge in that area. Is it overlying an aquifer that is either going to help us prevent seawater intrusion or help us with our overdraft problem? And then from there we can do further project investigation and more implementation projects such as this one.
So how many projects do you have that you're thinking about doing as a county?
So the county's already installed 3 projects, these 2 at Polo Grounds and 1 at Bromer Street Park. There's a number of projects that have been done by other agencies within the watershed, and right now we are looking in partnership with some of our fellow agencies to do another 4 projects in the basin in the next couple of years.
And these are all involved with capturing runoff, and mainly in municipal areas, right?
Right. So the county is interested in the more urban setting. This is where we own a lot of property, so that's a good place for us to start. We can capture a lot of the water that naturally will end up into the storm drains, the way our infrastructure has been built with a lot of impervious surface. So by capturing it and getting it in the ground, not only are we helping replenish the aquifer, we're treating stormwater runoff, and we're preventing it from causing downstream erosion.
So Betsy, what can people do? One of the things we're trying to do is look at things that people can do in their own lives that would help some of these issues that you've been talking about.
Well, certainly there's already a great effort all over the world for people to plant trees, and people are planting millions of trees, and that's a wonderful thing that people can do. Around here, where we have these magnificent redwood forests, it's really important to save these trees because they're already to the point where they're the best we have on the face of the earth for sequestering carbon. So we want to do everything we can to protect the bigger trees because they're already there doing it, whereas it's going to take 80 years for a little tree that you plant, a little redwood tree, to get to the point where it's pulling in the same amount of carbon that these are. So it's always good to plant trees, but then it's especially important to protect the big old trees.
And what could people do to help protect the big trees?
Well, it's important to get out and appreciate them, number one, like you can do in our beautiful state parks in California. And then it's also good to stay in tune with the legislation about how trees are harvested in California, because it's all done at the state level. And so it's good to just find out what's going on at the state level. There are groups, there's Forests Forever, there's the Sierra Club, there are other smaller groups that monitor what's going on in different regions. So it's really important to get familiar with how trees are harvested, how the regulations are made, and if you really care about it, start writing those letters, sending those emails, signing those petitions.
Okay. Thank you for our visit, and it's been great to see
thanks
what's
for
going
your
on.
efforts making movies and trying to just explain the story to people, because I think personally that this soil story is the most important story of the 21st century. I think it's how we're going to address climate change, and it's how we're going to address the health crisis that we find ourselves in, and there's nothing that needs doing more than this anywhere.
We hope we have interested you in this ecologic approach to climate change, a grassroots understanding of the interdependence of the cycles of water, soil, and vegetation, helping to sequester carbon and cooling the climate. How we participate in this growing movement is up to us. Please check our website for more resources that we've talked about in the film. It's climatechangehitshome.com.